This video was made possible with the support of our Patreon members. Welcome and thank you for tuning in to Psychology Is. I am your host, Nick Fortino. I'm so excited to have with me today Dr. Joanna Moncrieff. Welcome, Dr. Moncrieff.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. I think our audience members are going to be very excited to see you as a guest for the second time. So Dr. Moncrieff, let me give you a proper introduction, is a professor at University College London and a consultant psychiatrist for the National Health Service. She's also founder, member, and co-chairperson of the Critical Psychiatry Network and a very successful researcher and author. Our first interview was published on January 14th of 2021. So it's been almost exactly 4 years since we last spoke. It was the 9th episode that you were on of the Psychology Is podcast, and this is now episode 72.
Wow.
So, and many of our episodes, since we last spoke have focused exactly on what you and I discussed in our first conversation, which was essentially what the public needs to know about psychiatry. Since our first interview, you've been busy.
I have.
Yes, indeed. You, and perhaps most notably, as many people are well aware, your massive umbrella review of the evidence related to the serotonin theory of depression, and that paper, which was published in 2022, garnered, as you put it, a storm of interest and became one of the most widely read and influential papers of modern times, ranking in the top 5% of all scientific papers ever written in terms of how many times it's been read, and in the top 1% since 2022. So what an incredibly, incredible success. Although, I mean, not that it wouldn't have been successful had it not got that attention. But anyway, it made such a huge splash and has been so influential. So, congratulations on making such a big impact.
Thank you. I mean, I think those facts speak to why it was so important to do that research. There was so much interest because people didn't know. Many people hadn't even got an inkling that there was any doubt about the idea that serotonin and serotonin deficiency causes depression. People thought it was an established fact, whereas actually, the evidence has never been convincing, at least not for the last few decades since people have really been researching it properly.
Mm. And this extreme interest in your paper sparked you to write your new book, Chemically Imbalanced: The Making and Unmaking of the Serotonin Myth. And all the testimonies about it are just, use the strongest language possible. For example, James Davies wrote, "The most important health book written in decades. This book should be read by all psychiatrists and physicians with depressed patients," and many other, extremely positive testimonies.
And again, I think that speaks to the fact that there's a lot of interest because a lot of people are taking antidepressants. So it really is a very important subject.
That's a good point. Yes, it is directly relevant to millions and millions of people. And if it's not obvious, the reason that it's so significant that we have kind of exposed the lack of evidence to support the serotonin theory of depression is because the serotonin theory is the principal justification of the use of antidepressants. And if I may, I've copied, of course, the conclusion of that study. So I'll read that just so people have some context, and then I'll ask you to give just a brief summary of what that study entailed before we dive into the book. So the conclusion I'll read, you wrote, "The main areas of serotonin research provide no consistent evidence of there being an association between serotonin and depression, and no support for the hypothesis that depression is caused by lower serotonin activity or concentrations. And then you add that some evidence was consistent with the possibility that long-term antidepressant use reduces serotonin concentration. So can you give us a sense for people who don't know, what did this study entail?
So what we did was we got together all the research that's been done over the last few decades into possible links between serotonin and depression. So that question has been looked at in a number of different ways. For example, people have measured serotonin levels in the blood and plasma. You can't measure serotonin directly in the brain in human beings for obvious reasons. You can't stick needles into people's brains, but you can measure the levels of a metabolite of serotonin in the cerebrospinal fluid. So that's another sort of study that's been done, measuring levels of that metabolite in people who are depressed and comparing them to people who are not depressed. And then people have also looked at various serotonin receptors. They've looked at the serotonin transporter protein, which is what antidepressants, particularly SSRIs, affect. They've looked at the gene for the serotonin transporter protein. And then also there've been a collection of slightly odd experiments where people have been given a drink that is thought to deplete the brain of serotonin by depriving the brain of the amino acid from which serotonin is made. Those are called tryptophan depletion studies. And the idea of those studies is that they've been done in volunteers without depression. And the idea was that giving people this drink would lower their brain serotonin and lead them to become depressed or to have a lowering of mood. So we got together the research in all these different areas. And basically we found that in none of the areas was there a consistent pattern of a relationship between a serotonin abnormalities, either increased or decreased serotonin and depression. Of course, there were some studies that showed in some areas that showed that depression might be associated with low or sometimes high serotonin levels, but overall there was no pattern of effect. So, for example, there was no difference between people with depression and people without depression in terms of their levels of serotonin in the blood or serotonin in the or the serotonin metabolite breakdown product in the cerebrospinal fluid. The studies of serotonin in the blood or in the plasma were it consisted of a meta-analysis of 3 quite large studies. I should say, sorry, that because there's been so much research in this area, we didn't look at every single study individually. We looked at other reviews and meta-analyses of studies in each area. And that's why it's called an umbrella review. That's what an umbrella review consists of. So when we looked at the studies of levels of serotonin in plasma, we found that there was no effect of having depression, but there was an effect of taking antidepressants. So people who were taking antidepressants, whether or not they were depressed or not, showed lower levels of serotonin, whereas people who were depressed but not taking antidepressants did not show any difference in their serotonin
Groundbreaking
from
finding.
people who weren't depressed. So and weren't using antidepressants. So and in fact, that finding that serotonin levels are lower in the blood of people who are using antidepressants long term has been found in other studies as well. So that was a complete surprise to me. I didn't know that we'd find that. So that's why I made that's one of the bits of evidence on which that comment about antidepressants was based. And the other area of evidence that was interesting was the genetic studies, because of the fact that some of the early genetic studies suggested that there might be a link between the gene for the serotonin transporter and having depression. And then people suggested that maybe it wasn't just having the gene, maybe it was an interaction between having the gene and having adverse life events or being the victim of abuse or maltreatment in childhood. And so several studies came out suggesting that there might be this interaction effect. It was very clear that the larger, more modern, higher quality studies found no effect either of the gene or of an interaction between having the gene and having adverse events. But there was a very strong relationship between having adverse events and depression. So that research was interesting, both because it showed this link between adverse events and depression, but also because it showed how a research area can start off by showing some positive findings, and then gradually, as the studies get bigger and better, it turns out that those positive findings were spurious. Maybe it was some publication bias or something that led to them. So that was the results of our serotonin review. As you said, it sparked a lot of interest among the general public. Lots of people were really shocked because they thought, most members of the public thought that a link between serotonin and depression had been established. They weren't aware that it was just a theory that might have a bit of evidence but might not. They thought it was an established fact. And by getting all this evidence together in one place, we were able to show that it's really not an established fact.
And I think I appreciate you clarifying for people what an umbrella review is. It's kind of the bird's eye view of bird's eye views. It's kind of meta. And that's what we need. We need that perspective to see the broadest level of the literature to draw these conclusions. We need to compile massive amounts of data. So I appreciate so much that you and your co-researchers did this. So I'll read, there was right in the preface of your book, you wrote that for decades, people have been told, as you were just saying, that depression is a biological condition and that antidepressants work and save lives as if these are indisputable facts. They are not, you write. And you write, as I show in this book, these beliefs are part of a myth, one that was constructed and is maintained to further various vested interests and bears little resemblance to the scientific reality. And so one of my questions, especially as we consider how much pushback is an understatement. I mean, the extreme resistance that you were met with upon publishing this, that leads me to the question, who are these vested interests that benefit from the myth of the chemical imbalance?
Very good question. So, of course, the pharmaceutical industry has done very well out of this idea. And the pharmaceutical industry are primarily responsible for having inculcated it into popular belief, having persuaded us all that this is, a real fact. But the pharmaceutical industry are not terribly invested in antidepressants anymore. Most of them are now off patent. And not being heavily advertised or promoted. They've moved on to other conditions. So what's becoming apparent now is that the people who want to defend this myth are a section of the psychiatric profession who want people to believe that depression is a biological condition. They probably have good intentions. I'm sure they think that's, I'm sure they believe that is the case. But what really concerns me is that they don't really want people to know the poor state of the evidence to support that idea. They don't want people to know that actually there's very little evidence to support that idea. And in fact, one could say really no good, strong supporting evidence for the idea that depression is a biological condition. And it seemed to me, certainly with the pushback that I got after the book, that what some psychiatrists were trying to do was to shut down debate about the nature of depression so that people wouldn't realize that that is the state of affairs.
And maybe you just made it clear and I am just not catching it, but why? Like, psychiatrists are scientists, they're medical doctors, they're very well trained, they're typically highly intelligent people with good intentions. Why is there such this strong attachment to this treatment intervention?
Yeah, another good question. So, what distinguishes psychiatrists from other people who work in the mental health field is their medical training. So psychiatrists are generally, subscribe to the idea that mental health problems are like other illnesses, so that it legitimates them being doctors and medical doctors
Mm,
having a role in the treatment of people with mental health problems.
mm,
And what's interesting is that antidepressants in particular seem to embody this idea of the medical nature of mental health problems for many psychiatrists.
right.
Because, for example, other treatments like benzodiazepines in this country, psychiatrists aren't terribly invested in prescribing benzodiazepines or, trying to defend them and recognize the dangers of dependence and all that sort of thing. And I know that many psychiatrists are quite uh, disconcerted by the sort of huge promotion of ADHD and drug treatment for ADHD at the moment. But most psychiatrists want to believe that antidepressants are effective treatments. And I think it's because depression, or something that, sort of general distress that we currently label as depression, it makes up the bulk of problems that psychiatrists see in an outpatient setting. And I write a bit in my book about how important it was for psychiatrists a few decades ago to extricate themselves from the old asylums and the arena of treating people with really severe mental health problems such as psychosis and schizophrenia, which were what afflicted most of the inmates of those, old long stay asylum/hospitals. So uh, and this was because these places had come to be perceived as custodial institutions that no one got better from, and therefore weren't. It didn't really help psychiatrists to improve their status within medicine. So therefore, psychiatrists in the 1960s onwards tried to cultivate an outpatient practice, and depression, or as I say, sort of the general distress that we now refer to as depression, made up the bulk of that. And of course, psychiatrists wanted to have something medical to offer people in that situation. So I think
Yeah.
that's the main reason, that being able to offer a medical treatment such as a drug is what distinguishes psychiatrists from other mental health professionals and therapists and people who might other people who work in this area. But I also suppose it is it is a common human trait to want to help people. And when someone comes in distress to see a doctor or someone with a medical qualification, what you're taught as a doctor, as a medical student, is to prescribe a physical treatment such as a drug. So that's how psychiatrists know how to help people. And it's become, because of this massive promotional campaign by the pharmaceutical industry, it's become what people expect as well. So sometimes it's difficult for psychiatrists not to prescribe something, even if they think there might be other options. So I think that there are all these factors, this sort of drive for professional status, but also this desire to do something to help, that
Right.
that mean that psychiatrists want to believe that they have specific medical treatments for a condition such as depression.
Mm, makes perfect sense. Yeah. What's kind of standing out to me from what you just said is There's a certain entrenchment in a paradigm that gets well established, probably during medical training. There's a certain preservation of status that comes with the prescription pad that distinguishes psychiatrists from all other mental health care professionals. There's the general pattern within the history of psychology or psychiatry, excuse me, of um, crises of legitimacy and attempts to salvage the reputation of the field. And this trend, especially like in the US, especially with the DSM, especially starting in with the DSM-3 in 1980, there's kind of a clear difference starting then where the language becomes much more medicalized. And a concrete example of that is the removal of the word neurosis. I know you addressed that in the book as well, and I've long thought about that, how, the first couple editions of the DSM, there were still remnants of psychoanalysis and of psychology. But starting with the DSM-3, there was this departure from that and an attempt to establish itself as a legitimate medical field, which this kind of leads me to a couple other questions. So I do want to talk about the nature of depression. I love the chapter on that in your book. I think it's extremely insightful. I also want to zoom in a little bit though on the antidepressant topic again. So there's two things I want to bring up. One is what the adverse effects are, and the other is what you have long described as the distinction between the disease-centered uh, model of drug action and the drug-centered model of drug action. So two things here, two topics, and I'll start with the adverse effects. So when writing about the downsides of antidepressants, which include the potential for drowsiness, lethargy, emotional numbing, dizziness, weight gain, birth complications, strokes, reduced bone mineral density, agitation, impulsivity, suicidality, aggression, sexual dysfunction, and severe and prolonged withdrawal reactions upon discontinuing. You state that your statement was no one should be prescribed antidepressants anymore without being warned about these effects in the strongest possible terms. Yet the medical community has not been quick to publicize these adverse effects. So even though you kind of answered it already, I'd love to hear you speak directly to this. Why not? Why hasn't the medical community been quick to publicize these adverse effects?
So just before I get onto the why, in my book, I emphasize two particular adverse effects. As you've read off a long list, and they're all relevant, but two that I think are relatively common and under-recognized and very worrying are the propensity for dependence and the fact that some people seem to have real difficulty getting off these drugs and can have really protracted, prolonged periods of very debilitating withdrawal symptoms, and then symptoms that go on even after they've stopped taking the drug for years at a time. So I think that's something that we really need to recognize. And the other adverse effect that has been emerging recently through reports of patients is the persistent sexual dysfunction. So it's well recognized that antidepressants, particularly SSRIs, but also other antidepressants, cause sexual dysfunction while people are taking them in a high proportion of people. And David Healy, who's a psychopharmacology researcher now based in Canada, who you may have interviewed, I don't know, he's got some very interesting ideas. Anyway, he suggests it's probably around 100% of people have some sexual dysfunction if they're taking an SSRI. But what's become apparent that's really worrying is that a proportion of people, and it may not be that many, but, remember, lots of people are using these drugs, have persistent sexual dysfunction after they stop taking the antidepressant for months and sometimes for years afterwards. And this particularly manifests as a reduction in libido and is probably associated with emotional numbing as well. So it's a sort of general numbing of feelings and sensations. And this, the fact that many more young people are using antidepressants makes this particular effect really, really, really worrying. And I really think people need to know about it, and it's not been highlighted enough. And it's come to light because people have been reporting it, but actually it turns out there's animal research confirming this, animal research showing that there are persistent effects on sexual functioning in animals that have been given antidepressants, SSRIs particularly, and then come off them. So I think these two effects need to be highlighted. Why
Yes.
have they not been? Again, this comes down to, I think, the fact that the medical profession wants to think of the treatments they have to offer, in a rosy light. They want to think of them, and they don't want to think about their downsides too much. But it also comes back to the question that we're probably moving on to, which is how we understand what psychiatric drugs are doing. And so maybe I could start, explaining. So
Please.
the conventional way of understanding how psychiatric drugs work, if they work, is this idea that they work by targeting the underlying biological mechanisms of a disorder or of the symptoms of a disorder. So with antidepressants, there's been the idea that they targeted the underlying serotonin abnormality and replenished the low serotonin supply. And that's how and because it was thought that lack of serotonin might lead to depression, that was how they were thought to work. And other drugs have been thought to work in the same way. Sometimes there have been theories that have explained that in the same way as the serotonin theory, but sometimes it's just been implicit. And because we've had that idea that the drugs are targeting some underlying mechanism, we've been focused on that. And we have failed to understand that these drugs are drugs that change our normal brain chemistry and our normal brain activity. And we've not explored what those changes are and how those changes affect our normal mental states, our normal feelings, our normal thought processes, our normal patterns of behavior, which we should be interested in if we're going to give people drugs that change the normal state of the brain. And no one is disputing that. We know that these drugs cross into the brain and affect the brain in some way. And if we're going to do that, we should have an interest in the changes that they produce and how that is manifested in changes in people's thinking and feelings and behavior. And we haven't, because we've been focused on this idea that they reverse an underlying mechanism. So this idea that they reverse an underlying mechanism or disease process is what I've called the disease-centered model of drug action. And it is the way that most drugs work in general medicine. In fact, even if we don't quite understand how they work, we still have a fair idea that they're working on a mechanism. Even drugs like painkillers, like paracetamol, we don't quite understand the full way that it works, but we can assume that it works on a pain mechanism because it reduces pain. And it doesn't have what we might call mind-altering or psychoactive effects. It doesn't make you feel particularly different when you take it. Now, psychiatric drugs are different from that because they do make you feel a bit different. They cross the blood-brain barrier. They change our normal brain chemistry and brain activity, as I said, and therefore they have what we might refer to as mind-altering effects. We know other drugs that have mind-altering effects, like alcohol, like recreational drugs like heroin or cannabis. All these drugs change the way that we change our thought patterns, our sensations, our feelings, our emotions, and our patterns of behavior, our levels of arousal, etc. And if you give someone a drug that does that, it seems to me it will inevitably impact on people's underlying feelings. So that if people are, feeling sad or gloomy or disappointed or depressed, and they have, a good lot of alcohol to drink, it may temporarily replace the alterations induced by alcohol will temporarily replace your underlying feelings. We have a term for this. We call it drowning your sorrows. And what I'm suggesting, which I have called a drug-centered model, to emphasize that psychiatric drugs are drugs, that is, substances that change the normal state of our biology. So what I'm emphasizing is that psychiatric drugs work in this same way, and I've called this the drug-centered model of drug action. I hope that was a clear enough explanation.
Crystal clear. And it's
just to add to that, the drug-centered model was the way that people understood drugs as acting, including prescription drugs, for most of the 20th century. And it's really only when the pharmaceutical industry come along and run these big advertising campaigns in the 1990s and disease awareness campaigns and persuade everyone that they have a chemical imbalance that people start to subscribe to the disease-centered model. Although doctors had been developing this disease-centered model before then.
And I think all of the claims that people have made, sometimes directly to you, that you are somehow like being dangerous with this, presentation of evidence is reflective of the disease-centered model, right? Because they're acting like you're going around telling people with diabetes to stop taking insulin, when it's much more like you're going around highlighting that, for example, if you're relying on alcohol to drown your sorrows, that might not be the best approach. Or at least you need to be very lucid about what exactly is happening there. And you rightly point out in the book, we have the correct intuitions when we take other psychoactive substances like alcohol. We know what's happening. We understand we're not correcting anything. We're just inducing a state of mind that is a relief in some way, or it's preferable in some way. And so we know what's happening. But as we, as we're talking about, the problem with prescription psychiatric drugs is that people don't think of it in that way. So their intuition is thwarted and they think of it in this disease-centered way, which leads them to think, I need this. This is crucial for my well-being, and it would be irresponsible to suggest otherwise. So thank you for
absolutely.
that. Yeah.
Just if I could just add to that.
Please.
So you've put it really well. What I want people to do is really think very clearly about how the drugs affect them and what are the pros and cons of those effects. And there are some situations where I think taking a prescription psychiatric mind-altering drug is a good thing, is preferable to the mental turmoil that people are going through. So, for example, people who are undergoing an acute psychotic episode, I think, can be helped by taking an antipsychotic drug, although I don't believe that these are targeting anything specific in the way that their name suggests. They do induce a state of emotional numbness and emotional indifference. They slow down thinking altogether, and that can, for some people, enable them to distance themselves from their psychotic experiences and become less invested in them and less distressed by them. And so I think that's an example that antipsychotics don't always work in that situation. They're not always useful, but for some people, I think they are useful in that way, dampening down what's happening and allowing people to step back from it. So there are some situations where I think drugs can be useful, but I think we need to think about them differently. And I would suggest this is a much more intelligent way of thinking about drugs. We need to really understand everything that they do and think about them very carefully, rather than this, rather simplistic model that, you've got something that target, it's appealing because if it was true and the drugs, were perfect, I guess it would be a good thing. But, it's overly simplistic.
Sounds so logical.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting is what you just described as the situation where it would make sense to prescribe a psychiatric drug. What you just described is such an extreme contrast from what I think is the most common scenario in which they are prescribed. We have, what's much more common than acute psychosis is the 16-year-old girl whose self-esteem is really low and doesn't feel like her friends really like her and doesn't get enough attention at home, things like that. Or the older man who's lonely and just doesn't speak to his friends and family much anymore. And we have all of these most common situations where people are prescribed psychiatric drugs that are really nothing like what you just described as a situation where it would make sense and be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Um,
and and I think describing those situations also helps highlight one of the other adverse effects of antidepressants, which I think is really important, which is the psychological effect that they undermine people's um, ability or motivation to address their problems in a different way. And and they reinforce this idea that we are powerless, that we're just, a victim of our brain chemistry, and there's not much that we can do about it. And there is evidence to show that, people who have absorbed this idea about having a chemical imbalance, for example, have worse outcomes and are less likely to believe that there's anything they can do to improve their situation. So I think, this idea that that mental health problems are biological brain disorders, and that you need um, psychiatric drugs to put them right is profoundly disempowering and can be really harmful, and can, you know, lower people's self-esteem even further in the long run. Even though sometimes people get a blip, a bit of a benefit from it, maybe initially, because they go and see the doctor at a low point. The doctor says, "Oh, this is what's happening. You've got this brain chemical imbalance. Here's an answer to it." And people think, "Oh, thank goodness, there's a nice simple um, remedy for this situation." So initially, people might feel a bit better, but then, of course, it's not as simple as that. They don't get better. Then, they think that they need another drug, or they think they've failed in some way. They failed to respond to the treatment. So it just actually compounds people's low self-esteem and lack of confidence in many cases, I believe.
that I mean, that might be one of the most important points in this whole conversation is the risk that the drug would undermine the capacity to actually solve the problems that the depression is stemming from. Such an important point. And this is a good segue to the next topic I wanted to bring in, which is the nature of depression and what the better theories are and what the stronger evidence is for what contributes to it. So, if I may give a bit of a long preamble to the question here, I just want to read some of what you've written and maybe share a perspective on something. So, you spend time in the book talking about what depression is, and you point out that, quote, many doctors and members of the public now assume that depression is a biological disorder, but there are other ways to think about it. I will suggest you say that emotions and moods are better characterized not as brain events, but as the distinctive reaction of intelligent creatures to their circumstances. And if I now may comment that, in this vein, as a college professor for about 10 years now, I've heard many students talk about this concept that they've been fed of non situational depression, which they use to try and, I think, emphasize that their experience of depression is not really relatable to the common person, and that some people might feel sad when something happens, but their experience, their depression is, quote, non situational. And um, I contend lovingly that there's no such thing as non situational depression because there's no such thing as a person who is not in a situation. And I recognize that the reasons we feel depressed are sometimes obvious and other times vague. but we are always and completely embedded in situations, in circumstances. And so, aside from when there is a primary biological cause that is presenting as depression, it's never totally unrelated to our circumstances. So, so speaking of this potential for a biological cause, can you talk to us about the following quote that you wrote? Depression is enabled and influenced by our biology, but not caused by it in the way that symptoms of Parkinson's disease are caused by progressive degeneration of parts of the brain. So, can you elaborate on this distinction between the enabling role of our biology versus the causal role of our biology?
Yeah. Yeah. So I took this idea from the philosopher Peter Hacker, who I mention in the book, who I've got to know a bit over the last few years. And I find his writing really clarifying, really inspiring. And he is inspired by Aristotle in this, in describing human beings or living beings as biological creatures that have capacities and abilities and feelings. And I think the capacity to react to our environment, to evaluate our environment, is one of those, and our moods and emotions are a consequence of the fact that we evaluate our environment. That we say, "Oh, we like this situation, we don't like that situation. That situation's frightening. This situation makes us feel good." So I suppose what that emphasizes is that you have to understand human capacities and human feelings and human reactions at the level of the human being, rather than looking to understand them at the level of the brain, unpicking the brain. As you said in the quote, and as I said in the quote, we need our large brains to be able to do this. This doesn't suggest that we're somehow sort of disembodied creatures, but you have to understand feelings and emotions and behaviors at the level of the human being, rather than at the level of biological mechanisms. And it's maybe interesting to note, because you mentioned the DSM earlier as well, that in the middle of the 20th century, leading psychiatrists thought this way. And they talked about all forms of mental disorder as reactions. So you could have a depressive reaction, or a manic reaction, or a psychotic reaction. And they were called reactions. It was partly the influence of psychoanalysis, but it was a broader idea that these situations were reactions to people's circumstances, which might be quite bizarre reactions and quite extreme reactions in some cases. It didn't necessarily imply that they were normal or commonplace. But nevertheless, it was emphasizing that we are reactive creatures. That's what we are. We're always, looking around and evaluating our circumstances and our environment. And so I agree with you that depression and emotional problems are always, or almost always, a response to something that's going on in someone's life, although they may not be aware of what that is. I think it's quite common, when you feel distressed, that you can't necessarily immediately pinpoint why.
Right.
That's quite understandable, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a reason if you delve into it. And of course, the other thing to say is that the other influence of our biology is that we are different. We are individually different, and so some of us will be more emotionally sensitive than others, and more prone to depression or anxiety or other emotional problems than other people. So there is some role of biology in making up our personality and our temperament and our vulnerabilities. But that, as I say, is different from the idea that there is a specific mechanism that leads to depression.
Yes.
And another point to make that maybe also clarifies this is we really have no evidence that there is a link between any particular feeling or emotion and brain chemical mechanism, despite the numerous claims in the media that we found the chemical basis of love or anger or risk taking, whatever it is. And so, sorry, forgot my train of thought from it.
Well, if I may kind of add to what
Yes,
you're
go on.
saying a little bit, it's a very interesting and very philosophical question that we're considering right now. The nature of brain activity, and what does that brain activity mean? What does it reflect? And is it always the case that the causal arrows point only in the direction of brain to behavior or brain to mental activity? And I would firmly argue definitely not. That, for example, I think a good concrete example maybe is there's evidence that combat veterans, upon returning from combat, experience hypervigilance, which makes perfect sense, as that is an adaptation to a combat environment, and that their amygdalae have are enlarged, are typically larger than the average person. And so here we have a case where obviously the reason that their amygdalae have grown in size is because the way in which they had to respond and adapt to the environment they were in. And so this might be a good, like, concrete example of the way that the brain enabled their hypervigilance, and it underwent changes to better facilitate hypervigilance. But it would not make sense to say that the brain caused their hypervigilance. It makes a lot more sense to say the environment and having to adapt to it caused the hypervigilance, and that hypervigilance was enabled by changes in the brain.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so of course, if you're very depressed and you've taken to bed and you're not doing anything, it's likely that your brain will look different and be acting in a different way
Yes,
than if you're super active, and writing a book or a thesis or something like that.
exactly.
But another the point I was going to make is that there's no particular reason or evidence to think that there will be a perfect one-to-one relationship between a particular brain mechanism and a particular feeling or emotion. And we can think of the situation of what we call the fight or flight response, which is associated with arousal and increased adrenaline, for example. And we know that that physiological state can be associated with many different types of emotion, can be associated with anger and aggression, but also with anxiety and fear, and also with joy and elation. So I think this idea that, that every particular feeling is going to be reflected in a particular brain chemical state is a mistake, is probably a massive oversimplification.
Mhm. Completely agree. And maybe if I may ask you to just make one more comment on the nature of depression, before we pivot to basically the question of, if not antidepressants, then what? But right before we get to that question, on the nature of depression, I definitely encourage people, and if anyone wants to contact me and get a PDF of like the DSM-5, I encourage people to look at that for themselves. It's very, in my opinion, not only revealing, but damning on the field of psychiatry, with all due respect to the brilliant people within the field. But the paradigm, I mean, it doesn't take all that much critical thinking to recognize the highly subjective nature of these diagnoses and of these conceptualizations. And one thing I'll say about this that I think is very important is there was in my opinion, extreme change to the conceptualization of depression from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5. And that was that in the DSM-4, there was this um, stipulation that if the person was experiencing grief, then you shouldn't diagnose them as having major depressive disorder if it was better explained by their grief. That was removed in the DSM-5. And that means that from DSM-4 to DSM-5 overnight, millions of people went from not having major depressive disorder to technically qualifying as having it. So that's just one example. And even just to read like the first note on the diagnostic criteria, I'm reading from the DSM-5 now. 5 or more of the following symptoms have been present during the same 2-week period and represent a change from previous functioning. And then at least one of those symptoms have to be depressed mood or loss of interest or pleasure. And then, of course, the criteria are listed. And like I said, I highly encourage people to read that for themselves, because what I think it really exposes is something you talk about, and I like to talk about too, is that when we think of clinical depression or official diagnoses, we imagine that there's some dividing line, some natural dividing line between the people who have it and don't have it, which also, I think, hypnotizes people into believing that if you have it, you're in this separate category and that it's discontinuous from normal. So you can't slide back to normal levels of it. So I guess I'm just curious to hear you speak on what I'm bringing up here about like this kind of illusion of a dividing line between clinical and non-clinical depression or any other condition.
I think it's a really important point, and I come across it too, that some people think that we can somehow distinguish between real depression, clinical depression, and sadness, ordinary sadness. And I think it's really, really important that people realize that we can't. There is no objective dividing line. There are these criteria that are completely subjective. I mean, why does being, sad for more than 2 weeks, why is that any different from being sad for less than 2 weeks? So there isn't a dividing line. And I think this also speaks to the fact that people feel that once they have a diagnosis, somehow some underlying biological state has been pinpointed, when it absolutely hasn't. All that a diagnosis is a label to describe the problems that you have described to your doctor. And another thing that I think is important here is, I think the DSM and those changes that you mentioned in DSM-5 and other changes that have happened in other versions of DSM actually reflect clinical practice. I think they occur after after changes in clinical practice, and are a way of bringing the sort of official processes of diagnosis in line with what's actually happening. So in clinical practice, antidepressants are being doled out to anyone who comes along and expresses distress, at least 2 or 3 times to their doctors, or anyone that comes along and, seems to be expressing more distress than the doctor seems to think is normal on that particular day. Or just someone who comes along and says, I really just can't handle the situation. Please, please give me something to help. And that might be someone who's just lost a spouse. We know that antidepressants are commonly prescribed to people who've been bereaved. But also, grief isn't something that just follows, that's just associated with losing, a close member of your family through death. Sorry. We can grieve when we lose a job or move away from an area or move house or, have any sort of major life change.
Right.
And of course, we have been medicating people who have those sorts of reactions for many decades.
Great point. Interesting point too about how it seems that what precedes these changes in the DSM is changes in practice. That's really interesting. So let's pivot to what I said we pivot to, which is generally the question of if not antidepressants, let's say someone's convinced, right? They're like, whoa, okay. So I guess there's not evidence for this. Of course, as you say, and as every responsible physician says, it's important that you don't stop your uh, drug treatment abruptly. There's a process of tapering. Um, and I'll just say really quick, I know we're getting close to the end of our time, but I interviewed a psychiatrist in the US. It was an amazing conversation. Her name's Kendra Campbell. And I found her after her video. She made a video on one of the social media platforms, TikTok, and it went viral. And it was in light of your study. So a good example of like how your work is literally changing the world in concrete ways. She uploaded a video after reading your study and apologized to all of her patients and former patients for misinforming them about the nature of their depression. And she has transformed her practice into one that really is specialized in tapering and helping people withdraw safely. So if anyone else is kind of, considering this and wants resources, I would be happy to provide them. I know a couple of psychiatrists now who are specializing in that. So just wanted to mention that. But again, I'll give a bit of a preamble to the question and then I'll give you the mic for the rest of the time. So the question that we're facing now is, if not antidepressants, then what can we do about depression? And I'll read one more excerpt from your book. So you wrote, understanding depression as an emotional reaction that is entwined, as all emotions are, with our individual history and character, means there is no universal substitute for antidepressants. Recovering from depression is a personal process that is different for each individual, depending on the circumstances that led them to feel depressed in the first place. You go on to say supporting people on this journey, whether as a professional, friend, or relative, is about helping people identify the causes of their discontent, worry, or despair, and how to address these. When circumstances cannot be easily resolved, it may involve making people feel accepted and supported as they wrestle with their emotions. Treating depression must therefore be first and foremost about helping people to address the problems in their lives. And you say for each individual, the methods and answers will be different. And then after making that statement, the next section in the book is titled, well, what if it doesn't work? And you share a quote from an email you received, which I'll read and let you respond to here, that I think gets us in this question. The person wrote, without a firm explanation or an alternative to antidepressants, I consider the publication of your findings to be potentially extremely dangerous. So what do you say to this?
So I think, as I express in the quote you read out, that we should get away from the idea that we are treating a single disorder. I think this is one of the problems, that we're trying to batter the brain with various things that we don't really quite understand, like antidepressants, rather than focusing on the person. If we understand depression in the way that we were discussing earlier, it's clear that what you have to do is support the individual to address what's gone wrong in their lives. And that's going to be, involve lots of different things for each person that you might see. So I think it's a different approach, and it's and people who are saying, demanding that there must be an alternative to antidepressants, I think are stuck in the same approach. They're stuck with that same paradigm of, there's a thing in my head that's gone wrong, and I need something to put that thing right again. So I think, the most important response to that email is we have to think about depression differently. It's not about finding a different way of tweaking your brain or tweaking you in some way. It's about supporting you as a person to address the difficulties that you're facing.
Mm. Amen to that. And, something that came to my mind earlier when we were talking about, like, the idea of non-situational depression, and when it is the case, I think that a person that the on paper, so to speak, from the outside point of view, it looks like there's nothing wrong at all in their life. Everything looks like it's going smoothly, and it seems that their needs are met, and there's no clear situational cause for the depression. I would just, propose the idea that I think the question of whether my life and the way I'm living it is authentic to who I am is a very important question. And I think that it's the reaction of an intelligent creature to feel off when that is not the case. And I might be living a life, like I said, that from the outside point of view looks perfect. But what is authentic to people is a whole different question. And it's not really, there's no template that society has to offer us when we look at the individual level. So I just want to kind of add that into everything we've said here for people who maybe have a hard time figuring out why it is that they feel off. And maybe there's the complicated element there of people feeling guilty that they feel depressed or off when everything is going well in their life. Like, why should I be feeling like this? What,
Yeah.
am I ungrateful or something? I just think it's important for people to ask that question. Is this the authentic life? Is it authentic to who I am? So
I
just wanted to
agree,
add
and
that last bit.
I think finding meaning is very
Yeah.
important for people, and not necessarily easy in our, secular world. A couple of hundred years ago, your meaning was given to you by your religion, and no one
Mm,
questioned it. And now we
mm,
have to work it out for ourselves,
mm,
even if we work it out in a religious way.
mm.
And I think that is difficult. And I just wanted to say one more thing on this subject, which is that for people who feel that there must be some sort of answer, we have to start from the position of first do no harm. We cannot just be prescribing things in order to do something, because antidepressants are toxic substances, as are all drugs. And so we can't just be giving them in order to do something. We do have to really be sure that they're doing more, producing more benefit than they're causing harm. And that there does seem to be quite a lot of evidence that it might be the other way round, that they might be doing more harm than benefit, certainly in for many people in many situations.
I feel like I can talk to you for hours, honestly, but I recognize we're at the end of our time. It's late in the evening for you. I'm off to go teach intro to psychology, but let's promote the book one more time here. It's called Chemically Imbalanced. It just came out, about a month ago, and so I just highly recommend it to people, especially who are steeped in this topic, in this conversation. Not only is it a great read with great flow and excellent writing, but it's just an important resource, I think, to refer back to share with other people who are skeptical about what we're talking about. So I highly recommend it. And maybe if people want to kind of track your work, where can they find you? Where can they track your work?
So thank you. I have a website which is at joannamoncrieff.com, which I put blogs up on occasionally. And I'm on Twitter at Joanna Moncrieff again, and on B-Sky.
Beautiful. Well, thank you from the bottom of my heart for your time today and for the way that you are changing the world.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you, Nick.